Hi everyone, I'm Dale Smith, aka Journo Dale, and we're here to talk about Canadian politics. There's been a lot of talk in the last week or so around message discipline and government messaging and so on, and there was a really good column in the Toronto Star by Susan Delacourt about how the government's lines are sounding pretty hollow when they've been saying Canadian or we've got Canadians' backs for months and months on end. And I thought I'd just talk a little bit about some of how that plays out in Canada. Message discipline is a much more pervasive thing than it used to be. And it's become a lot more so within the last 15, 20 years. And a lot of it has to do with the perceived success of it during the Harper years. Initially, the Conservative Party at the time, had a hard time getting elected because they would have so-called bozo eruptions, particularly during elections, and certain MPs would say things about same-sex marriage or abortion or so on and so on, and then that would turn against them. And so it became this notion about having this iron fist of message discipline, and they all had to repeat the same talking points and not deviate, and not put themselves in situations where they would have to basically answer something that was not on the book, which is why we suddenly stopped seeing Conservative candidates going to debates in ridings and so on. And that became a very pervasive thing, and something that still carries through to a certain extent today, although some of that message discipline in their own party has started to slip a little bit. But it was something the Liberals also picked up on as kind of a successful strategy. And they seem to think that, they've got a certain level of marketing panache that goes along with this. And it's created its own particular kind of, reinforcing cycle when it comes to the kinds of messages that they employ on a regular basis. There's a couple of things around the Conservative era that I just wanted to kind of highlight in terms of examples of where this kind of thinking came in. Part of it was just in question period. It was just a recitation of talking points. A lot of them were completely non sequitur to the questions that were being asked, but they had a list of prepared talking points that the ministers or parliamentary secretaries would use and very rarely deviate from. It's often as bad, if not worse, with the Liberals right now, with a few exceptions, but we'll get to those later. Another example of this kind of discipline that always sticks in my mind is there was the whole period when everyone was doing It Gets Better videos. And so a couple of Conservative staffers who were gay and lesbian decided they were going to make their own. And the staffers' messages were really quite heartfelt, but then they got a bunch of ministers and MPs to talk on the video, and they all repeated the same thing. They all had the same lines, and not one of them had a heartfelt or authentic message to give to it. It was, and you could see them reading the script in front of them for a lot of cases. And what got me was when one of the comm staffers from the PMO asked me about it, because obviously I was writing for Extra at the time. And he, was like, well, didn't you think that was great? And I said, no, it was inauthentic because they were all reading from scripts and all saying the exact same thing. But he was convinced that because they were saying the same thing, that they were all on message and all on the same page. And that was a really good thing that, that was important for them to show. But that defeated the point of it being a heartfelt and authentic message. And I tried to communicate this to him, and it was not, I don't know how well it penetrated. And just for context's sake, this former staffer is now a member of the cabinet in Ontario under Doug Ford, so make of that what you will. And to a certain extent, I think the Liberals currently are as bad, if not worse, than the former Conservatives were when it comes to this kind of message discipline. There's a lot of the same kinds of talking points being repeated over and over again. And one of my pet peeves was always, for example, whatever the question was, the minister would stand up and preface every single one of her remarks with, Mr. Speaker, the environment and the economy go together. And she would repeat that, whatever the question, and every single answer. And every time she was on an interview, she'd repeat the same thing. And then what got me was that she was also defending at the same time that, saying that she talks like a human being, and I guess she was trying to argue that she wasn't using jargon or kind of bureaucratic speak, but she was sounding like a robot with these pre-programmed phrases, and that I don't think has penetrated with a lot of these same kinds of MPs and ministers today. It is my frequent refrain in most of my columns, not most of, but a lot of my columns, that this is a government that is incapable of communicating their way out of a wet paper bag. And this is part of the reason, is because they are so hung up on talking points that are insisting on being, positive or happy, clappy, if it's not just outright pablum, because they are convinced that this is how you get people to pay attention. This is that people only, the general public only starts to get these messages penetrating by the time people like me are rolling their eyes at it. And I have a problem with that particular way of thinking, because there's no authenticity to the use of talking points, as repetitive as they are, but also they're just so inauthentic and formulaic. And I mean, this is a phenomenon across the Western world, where talking points are evasive and fuzzy and trying to convey a sense of empathy without giving any specifics on the subject matter, things like that. And it's done deliberately with a way of kind of not providing answers that could be uncomfortable, or to make the lives easier of the people who are responding so that they don't have to know all of the intricate details of their file, and they can spew a talking point and that'll be that. It's also kind of why talking points in question period are very much something that they fall back on, rather than having a concrete answer on the file 29 times out of 30. There are exceptions to this rule, however, but I think it's worth pointing out that the over-reliance on these talking points and on the message discipline hurts them more than it helps them. And there's some good examples of that currently. I mean, the boil water advisories on First Nations reserves, they haven't been able to effectively communicate the good news that they solved more of those than they had in the inventory when they formed government, that they expanded the inventory to include formerly private services that they then brought into the ones that were public under the government, and fixed a lot of those as well. And they're not terribly good at communicating what the issues are with the remaining ones, which are a small number in comparison to what it was when they formed government. And this, bit them in the ass a lot during the election, and Trudeau was whining to columnists in interviews that, it's the cynicism that was killing him, that people were believing that nothing had been done. But that's partially his own fault for not being able to communicate that and not being able to communicate that effectively. Because if it's a talking point, then people are tuning out. Another example is with the litigation around that compensation for First Nations children that were in care. The government was not fighting the compensation itself. They were fighting the precedent that the tribunal was setting, because the tribunal was exceeding their statutory authority in their estimation. And that is a big deal for any government, regardless of the stripe. But they were unable to communicate this fact and to say that, there is a problem with the tribunals overreaching their authority in making the decision that they did. But they were not ever able to communicate that. They would mumble something about jurisdiction, and then that would be it, which is not effective and does not explain things. And I was the only journalist who went and dug into it and actually talked to people in the legal profession to understand what it was exactly that was going on. And that's a problem for any government who is trying to not look like complete dicks on a file like that. And that's on them, because they rely on their stupid talking points and reciting the same happy clappy lines and burying it in pablum and thinking that they've called it a day. And like I've said, it's not universal, and there are a handful of ministers who I think do deserve a little praise for not constantly relying on talking points, and who are able to be frank and upfront when they talk. First and foremost of those, I will say, is Carla Qualtrough, Minister of Social Development currently. And she's one of the few who will actually be blunt and, take responsibility for things and not try and talk around them. So I think that's important, but it doesn't happen enough. Mark Miller's another good one, who is now Indigenous Services. He, again, around some of the litigations and some of the First Nations water issues, I think could be a little stronger in terms of some of the frankness that is necessary. But he's generally not. He doesn't recite talking points, and that's a good thing. Sean Fraser, who is now Immigration Minister, is also pretty good on not simply reciting talking points. When he was Parliamentary Secretary to Finance, he would be pretty good about being able to explain something without using a canned line, and he's more or less carrying that forward through in his new role as Immigration Minister. And Marcy Ian, who is the Status of Women Minister and also Youth, and has the LGBTQ2 portfolio as well. When I did an interview with her about this portfolio, it was night and day compared to her predecessor, who was Bardish Chagger, because Chagger would have all the lines basically memorized and would simply recite them. Whereas I had an actual conversation with Marcy Ian, and I didn't get a single talking point the whole time. And so that was a refreshing change and something that we don't see enough of. There are other ministers who are okay some of the time, Dominic LeBlanc, Jonathan Wilkinson, Seamus O'Regan, David Lametti, more or less. Chrystia Freeland is hit and miss. Some days she's really good and on point, and some days she's got a line and she's going to stick to it. And when called out on some of that, or when asked to clarify or say something a different way, she will sometimes insist that I chose my words very carefully and repeat the same line. Her background in journalism helps in that she's able to communicate fairly effectively, but she does still sometimes rely on those lines. So this is a pervasive phenomenon. This government is as bad, if not worse, than the previous government for it. And it's something we need to be aware of. It's something we need to push back on. And we just need to, keep calling it out, that when we get the canned lines and the pablum and so on, that we call it out for what it is, so that we don't let them get away with it, or let them think that it's fine to keep communicating the way they are because everyone's on the same page, or those kinds of justifications, because it's not how people talk, and it is not how it sounds fake, and people can pick up on that. And I think that's a problem for every government and most political parties out there right now, particularly in Canada. And we should be demanding better. And that's everything for this week. Join us again next week for some more Canadian politics. I'm Dale Smith. That's at journo_Dale on Twitter. And don't forget to like the video, share, subscribe, and support us on Patreon. Thanks, everyone.